Marcus Thompson wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished restocking the emergency medical supplies in the trauma bay of Riverside Medical Center. The clock on the sterile white dot wall read 11:47 p.m., and his 12-hour shift as a medic was finally winding down. The downtown hospital had been unusually quiet for a Friday night, with only a few minor injuries and one elderly patient complaining of chest pains. Marcus had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before transitioning to civilian medical work, and after years of treating battlefield wounds, the peaceful evening felt almost too calm. He was looking forward to getting home to his small apartment, maybe catching the late sports highlights and sleeping in tomorrow for the first time in weeks. However, as he secured the last cabinet and prepared to clock out, the emergency alert system suddenly crackled to life throughout the hospital's overhead speakers. The automated voice announced that all medical personnel were to remain on duty due to an undisclosed emergency situation developing across the downtown district. Within minutes, the first ambulance sirens began wailing in the distance, growing louder and more frequent with each passing moment. Marcus exchanged concerned glances with the night nurse, Rebecca Walsh, a competent woman in her 30s who had worked alongside him for the past 2 years. She shrugged and began preparing additional trauma beds, her movements efficient and professional despite the uncertainty. The emergency department doors burst open as the first wave of victims arrived on stretchers, their conditions unlike anything Marcus had encountered in his extensive medical career. The patients displayed severe lacerations and what appeared to be human bite marks covering their arms, necks, and faces. Their wounds were deep and ragged, as if inflicted by someone in an uncontrolled frenzy. Several victims were unconscious and losing significant amounts of blood, while others thrashed violently against their restraints, requiring multiple staff members to hold them down. The attending physician, Dr. Patricia Williams, shouted orders across the chaos as more ambulances arrived every few minutes, each bringing increasingly disturbing cases. Marcus worked methodically, applying pressure bandages and starting 4 lines, but something felt fundamentally wrong about the entire situation. The bite patterns were too similar across different victims, and the aggressive behavior of the conscious patients seemed almost animalistic rather than human. Outside, police sirens joined the symphony of emergency vehicles, and through the hospital windows, Marcus could see smoke rising from several points across the city skyline. A young paramedic named Jake Morrison stumbled through the doors, his uniform torn and bloody, supporting his injured partner whose radio crackled with panicked reports from units across the metropolitan area. The dispatcher's voice grew increasingly frantic as she coordinated responses to what she described as multiple violent incidents involving groups of extremely aggressive individuals attacking civilians without apparent provocation. Marcus was suturing a particularly nasty wound on a construction worker's shoulder when the man's vital signs suddenly flatlined on the monitor. Following standard protocol, Marcus immediately began CPR while Rebecca prepared the defibrillator, but after several minutes of unsuccessful resuscitation attempts, Dr. Williams called the time of death at 12:34 a.m. They covered the body with a sheet and moved on to the next critical patient, but 10 minutes later, Marcus heard Rebecca scream from across the trauma bay. The supposedly deceased construction worker was sitting upright on the gurney, the sheet fallen away, his eyes now completely white and lifeless. His jaw hung open unnaturally wide, revealing blood-stained teeth, and he let out a low, guttural moan that sent chills down Marcus's spine. Before anyone could react, the reanimated corpse lunged forward with surprising strength and speed, grabbing Dr. Williams by the throat with pale, cold fingers. The doctor's terrified shrieks filled the trauma bay as the creature's teeth sank deep into her neck, tearing away flesh and sending arterial blood spraying across the medical equipment. Hospital security guards rushed in with their weapons drawn, but they hesitated, uncertain how to handle a situation that defied all logic and training. Marcus grabbed a heavy medical tray and struck the attacking figure across the head with enough force to knock it backward, temporarily freeing the severely injured doctor. As chaos erupted throughout the emergency department, military vehicles began rolling down the streets outside, their loudspeakers announcing that the entire downtown area was now under strict quarantine by order of the Department of Homeland Security. No one would be permitted to enter or leave the designated zone until further notice. Marcus realized with growing horror that whatever was happening in their city was far beyond a simple medical emergency, and their fight for survival was just beginning. 3 days had passed since the nightmare began at Riverside Medical Center, and Marcus Thompson found himself leading a desperate group of survivors through the abandoned corridors of Westfield Shopping Mall. The once bustling commercial center now stood as a hollow monument to normalcy, its storefronts dark and littered with debris from the initial panic. Beside him walked Jessica Rodriguez, a high school English teacher whose quick thinking had saved them from a horde of infected 2 days earlier when they escaped the hospital together. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her usually warm brown eyes now carried the hardened edge of someone who had witnessed unspeakable horrors. Tommy Bradley, a 20-year-old computer science student from the nearby university, clutched his backpack containing the group's only working electronics, including a solar-powered radio that had become their lifeline to the outside world. Rebecca Walsh, the nurse from the hospital, moved with professional calm despite the circumstances, her medical bag slung securely across her shoulder as she scanned their surroundings for potential threats. The mall's skylights cast eerie shadows across the polished floors, and every footstep seemed to echo louder than it should in the unnatural silence. Marcus had chosen this location because he remembered the layout from family shopping trips years ago, and he knew the anchor stores would likely contain useful supplies including food, clothing, and potentially medical equipment from the pharmacy. However, as they approached the central court area near the old fountain, a low moaning sound began to drift from the direction of the food court, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of multiple feet moving in unison. Jessica grabbed Marcus's arm and pointed toward the department store entrance where several shadowy figures were emerging from behind the security gates. The creatures moved with the distinctive jerky gait they had learned to recognize and fear, their clothes torn and blood-stained, their skin a sickly pale gray color that seemed to glow in the dim light filtering through the mall's windows. Tommy whispered that his radio had picked up emergency broadcasts describing these beings as carriers of some kind of viral infection that reanimated dead tissue, but the scientific explanation did little to reduce the terror of facing them in person. Marcus counted at least 8 of the infected individuals shambling toward their location, and he quickly motioned for the group to retreat toward the sporting goods store where they might find weapons or tools for defense. As they moved carefully along the storefronts trying to minimize noise, Rebecca accidentally knocked over a metal trash can near the jewelry kiosk, sending it clattering across the tile floor with a sound that seemed to reverberate throughout the entire mall. Immediately, the moaning grew louder and more urgent, and the infected began moving faster, their movements becoming more coordinated as they homed in on the source of the disturbance. The group broke into a sprint toward the sporting goods store, but as they rounded the corner near the old arcade, they discovered their path blocked by 3 more infected individuals who had apparently been feeding on someone behind the game machines. Marcus grabbed a heavy metal sign from a closed pretzel stand and swung it like a club, connecting with the first creature's head and sending it stumbling backward into a planter filled with dead decorative plants. Jessica found a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall and began spraying the chemical foam at the remaining 2 infected, temporarily blinding them and buying the group precious seconds to escape. They burst through the sporting goods store's entrance and immediately began barricading the doors with display racks and exercise equipment while Tommy worked frantically to find the store's back exit. Rebecca discovered a cache of camping supplies and began stuffing backpacks with emergency rations, water purification tablets, and first aid materials. From somewhere deep within the mall came the sound of breaking glass and more moaning voices, suggesting that their brief encounter had attracted additional infected from other areas of the complex. Marcus found a selection of baseball bats and camping knives, distributing them among the group while explaining that they needed to aim for the head based on what they had observed during their escape from the hospital. As they prepared to leave through the store's rear loading dock, they heard a voice calling for help from the auto repair shop across the employee parking lot. Through the security window, they could see a middle-aged man in mechanic's coveralls frantically waving at them from inside the garage bay, apparently trapped by several infected who were clawing at the building's metal doors. Jessica argued they should help him since he appeared to be alive and uninfected, while Tommy worried about the risk of exposing themselves to additional danger. Marcus made the decision to attempt a rescue, reasoning that they needed all the allies they could find in this new hostile world, and that someone with mechanical skills might prove invaluable for their long-term survival. Chat controls Sonnet 4. David Carter proved to be exactly the kind of ally the group desperately needed, his 45 years of mechanical expertise immediately valuable as they worked together to transform Jefferson Elementary School into a fortress against the undead plague that had consumed their city. The rescue from his auto shop had been harrowing, requiring a coordinated distraction involving Tommy throwing rocks to draw the infected away while Marcus and Jessica created an escape route through the garage's side window, but David's knowledge of engines, electrical systems, and structural reinforcement made the risk worthwhile. The elementary school had been Marcus's suggestion after remembering its layout from volunteer work he had done there during his Army Reserve weekends, and the single-story brick building offered several strategic advantages including limited entry points, a cafeteria with industrial kitchen equipment, and a playground surrounded by a chain-link fence that could serve as an early warning perimeter. David immediately began assessing the building's defensive capabilities, pointing out that the large windows in each classroom would need to be reinforced with metal sheeting or boards, while the main entrance could be fortified using desks and filing cabinets to create a barrier that would funnel any attacking infected into a narrow choke point where they could be more easily managed. Rebecca established a medical station in the nurse's office, organizing their limited supplies and creating an inventory of medications they would need to scavenge from nearby pharmacies or medical facilities, while Jessica took charge of cataloging the school's existing resources including canned goods from the cafeteria, cleaning supplies that could be repurposed for sanitation, and educational materials that might prove useful for long-term planning. Tommy set up their electronic equipment in the principal's office, using his technical skills to rig a solar charging station on the roof and establish a communication center where they could monitor emergency broadcasts and potentially contact other survivor groups if any existed in the surrounding areas. On their fourth day at the school, while David was reinforcing the gymnasium doors with steel bars salvaged from the playground equipment, they heard the distinctive crack of gunfire from the direction of the abandoned police station 6 blocks away. Marcus and Jessica conducted a careful reconnaissance mission, moving through the overgrown residential neighborhoods where abandoned cars sat in driveways and newspapers yellowed on front porches, creating an eerie snapshot of normal life interrupted by catastrophe. They discovered Emma Foster, a 52-year-old retired police officer who had barricaded herself in the station's evidence room after her fellow officers had either fled the city or succumbed to the infection during the initial outbreak chaos. Emma had managed to survive by rationing the vending machine snacks and using rainwater collected in evidence buckets, but she was running dangerously low on ammunition after fighting off multiple waves of infected who had been attracted to the station by its emergency generator. Her police training and weapons expertise made her an invaluable addition to their group, and she brought with her a collection of firearms, tactical gear, and most importantly, a police radio that still received intermittent transmissions from outside the quarantine zone. The news Emma shared was devastating but not entirely unexpected. The federal government had declared the entire metropolitan area a dead zone and established a 50-mile exclusion perimeter that was being enforced by military units with orders to shoot anyone attempting to cross the boundary. According to the radio chatter she had monitored, similar outbreaks had occurred in at least 6 other major cities across the country, and the official government position was that the infection was the result of a terrorist biological attack by an unknown foreign enemy. Emma's law enforcement experience also brought a sobering perspective to their survival planning, as she explained that in disaster situations, human nature often proved more dangerous than the actual catastrophe, with desperate people becoming increasingly willing to commit violence to secure resources for themselves and their families. She insisted on establishing strict security protocols for their school sanctuary, including watch schedules, password systems for anyone requesting entry, and contingency plans for different types of threats ranging from small groups of infected to potential raids by hostile survivors. David worked with Emma to create additional defensive measures, including tripwire alarms around the school's perimeter and reinforced firing positions that would allow them to defend their territory without exposing themselves to unnecessary risk. The group spent their evenings in the cafeteria, sharing meals prepared from their dwindling supplies while discussing their long-term strategy for survival, but underlying tensions began to emerge as different personalities clashed over leadership decisions and resource allocation priorities. Tommy argued for attempting to reach one of the rumored safe zones that emergency broadcasts occasionally mentioned, while Rebecca insisted they should focus on establishing a sustainable medical capability that could serve other survivors in the area. Marcus found himself increasingly thrust into the role of final decision-maker, a responsibility he neither wanted nor felt qualified for, especially when Emma's military-style approach to security conflicted with Jessica's more humanitarian instincts about helping other survivors they might encounter. Despite these growing internal challenges, the fortified school provided them with their first real sense of security since the outbreak began, allowing them to sleep through entire nights without constant fear and to begin planning beyond mere day-to-day survival. Chat Control Sonnet 4. 2 weeks into their occupation of Jefferson Elementary School, Tommy Bradley developed a severe infection in his leg from a cut sustained during the mall escape, and Rebecca's dwindling medical supplies forced the group to face their most dangerous mission yet: a coordinated scavenging expedition into the heart of the infected zone to reach Morrison's Pharmacy and the abandoned Food Mart grocery store. The young computer science student's condition had deteriorated rapidly despite Rebecca's best efforts with their remaining antibiotics, and his fever now spiked dangerously high during the night hours while delirious rambling replaced his usual technical chatter about radio frequencies and solar panel efficiency. Marcus made the difficult decision to split their group into 2 teams for maximum efficiency and coverage, knowing that their window of opportunity was closing as Tommy's infection spread and their food reserves dropped to less than 3 days' worth of canned goods and emergency rations. Emma Foster would lead the first team consisting of herself and Marcus to the pharmacy located in the downtown commercial district, while Jessica Rodriguez would command the second team with David Carter targeting the grocery store on the opposite side of their territory near the residential area where abandoned houses lined quiet streets filled with overturned cars and scattered personal belongings. The plan required precise timing and communication using the 2-way radios David had salvaged from his auto shop, with both teams departing at dawn and maintaining regular contact every 30 minutes to coordinate their movements and ensure neither group encountered more infected than they could handle alone. Rebecca would remain at the school to monitor Tommy's condition and provide medical support via radio if either team sustained injuries during their missions, while also maintaining their defensive perimeter in case opportunistic raiders or large groups of infected attempted to breach their sanctuary during the reduced manpower situation. Marcus and Emma moved through the early morning shadows using the route they had scouted from the school's rooftop, staying close to building walls and avoiding the main streets where abandoned vehicles created natural choke points that could trap them if they encountered hostile forces. The pharmacy sat in a strip mall that had clearly been the site of significant violence during the initial outbreak, with broken windows revealing ransacked interiors and dark stains on the concrete that neither Marcus nor Emma wanted to examine too closely. Emma's police training proved invaluable as she identified potential ambush points and escape routes before they approached the building, while Marcus's medical knowledge helped him prioritize which medications and supplies would be most critical for Tommy's recovery and their long-term health needs. Meanwhile, Jessica and David discovered that the grocery store presented different but equally challenging obstacles, as the automatic doors had been wedged open and the interior darkness concealed unknown numbers of infected who had apparently been drawn to the location by the scent of rotting produce and meat from the power outage that occurred during the first week of the crisis. David's mechanical expertise allowed him to rig a distraction using a shopping cart loaded with canned goods that he could remotely activate to create noise and movement in one section of the store while they gathered supplies from another area, but the plan required split-second timing and absolute silence during their approach through the loading dock entrance. As Marcus and Emma filled their backpacks with antibiotics, pain medications and surgical supplies from the pharmacy storage room, they began to notice subtle differences in the infected they encountered compared to their previous experiences with the creatures. The 3 zombies they found wandering near the prescription counter moved with slightly more coordination than expected, and their response to noise seemed more intelligent and purposeful rather than the mindless attraction they had observed during their earlier encounters. Emma whispered that these infected appeared to be adapting or evolving somehow, possibly developing enhanced sensory capabilities that made them more dangerous predators than the stumbling corpses they had initially faced during the hospital outbreak. This disturbing observation was confirmed when one of the creatures demonstrated an apparent ability to problem-solve by systematically checking behind different pharmacy displays rather than simply wandering aimlessly through the aisles like the infected they had encountered at the shopping mall. Jessica and David experienced their own unsettling discovery when they realized that several infected in the grocery store had positioned themselves in what appeared to be a coordinated ambush formation near the pharmacy section, suggesting a level of tactical thinking that contradicted everything they believed about the creature's limited cognitive abilities. The supply run ultimately succeeded in securing the critical medications Tommy needed for his recovery as well as enough non-perishable food to sustain their group for several additional weeks. But both teams returned to the school with troubling questions about the infected's apparent evolution and the implications for their long-term survival strategy. Marcus called an emergency meeting in the cafeteria that evening to discuss their observations and develop new protocols for dealing with potentially intelligent infected, while Rebecca administered the precious antibiotics to Tommy and monitored his vital signs for any improvement in his dangerous condition. The successful mission had cost them significant ammunition and revealed that their secure school sanctuary might not provide adequate protection against enemies who could think, plan, and potentially coordinate attacks rather than simply responding to basic stimuli like noise and movement. Chat Control Sonnet 4. The desperate knocking at Jefferson Elementary School's reinforced main entrance came during the pre-dawn hours of a cold October morning, 3 weeks after Tommy's successful recovery from his leg infection had restored the group's confidence in their ability to overcome the challenges of their new reality. Through the security window that David had installed using reinforced glass from the auto shop, Marcus could see a family of 4 standing in the pale moonlight. A middle-aged man carrying a young girl who appeared to be unconscious or sleeping, a woman clutching a teenage boy's hand, and all of them showing the telltale signs of prolonged exposure and malnutrition that had become the hallmark of survivors who had been living rough in the infected wilderness. Emma's police instincts immediately went on high alert as she observed the family through her binoculars from the rooftop watch position, noting that the father kept glancing nervously over his shoulder and shifting his weight from foot to foot in a manner that suggested either extreme anxiety or deception about their circumstances. Jessica's humanitarian nature strongly advocated for allowing the family inside their sanctuary, arguing that they had a moral obligation to help other survivors, especially when children were involved, while Emma countered that their security protocols existed for good reasons and that admitting unknown individuals could compromise everything they had worked to build over the past month. The family identified themselves as the Hendersons: Robert, Linda, their 16-year-old son Michael and 8-year-old daughter Katie, and they claimed to have been hiding in a basement storage room of an office building downtown until a group of infected had discovered their location and forced them to flee with only the clothes on their backs. Robert Henderson spoke through the intercom system that Tommy had rigged to the front entrance, explaining that they had been surviving on rainwater and vending machine snacks for nearly 2 weeks, and that little Katie had developed a serious cough that was getting progressively worse without proper medical attention. Rebecca's medical training made her sympathetic to the child's apparent respiratory distress, and she argued that turning away a sick child would violate every ethical principle that separated them from the lawless chaos consuming the outside world. After an intense debate that lasted nearly an hour while the Henderson family waited outside in the dangerous pre-dawn darkness, Marcus made the decision to admit them under strict quarantine protocols that would require them to remain isolated in the gymnasium for 72 hours while the group observed them for signs of infection or other problems. David and Tommy worked quickly to set up a temporary living space in the gym using sleeping bags, folding tables, and a portable heater that would provide the Henderson family with basic comfort while maintaining separation from the main group's living areas in the classroom wing. Emma established additional security measures including motion sensors near the gymnasium doors and a rotation of armed guards who would monitor the new arrivals around the clock, while Rebecca conducted thorough medical examinations that revealed no obvious bite wounds or other signs of infection among the family members. However, Robert Henderson had concealed a critical piece of information that would ultimately prove catastrophic for everyone at the school. During their desperate flight from the downtown office building, he had sustained a small puncture wound on his ankle from what he believed was just a piece of broken glass, but which had actually been the tooth of an infected child who had grabbed at him through a basement window grate. The bite was tiny and had barely broken the skin, healing quickly enough that Robert convinced himself it was insignificant and posed no threat to his family or potential rescuers, but the virus had already begun its work in his bloodstream. On the second night of their quarantine period, while his wife and children slept peacefully on their makeshift beds in the gymnasium, Robert Henderson began experiencing the early symptoms of transformation: severe headaches, elevated body temperature, and an increasing sensitivity to light and sound that made him restless and agitated. By 3 a.m, his condition had progressed to the point where his rational mind was rapidly being consumed by the viral infection, but his family remained unaware of the danger as they slept nearby. Tommy was on watch duty when Robert began his final transformation. The young man's attention focused on monitoring the radio for emergency broadcasts rather than observing the supposedly safe quarantined family. The newly turned Robert Henderson attacked his sleeping wife first, his infected teeth tearing into her throat before her screams could wake their children, and by the time Tommy realized what was happening and triggered the emergency alarm system, the gymnasium had become a nightmare scene of violence and chaos. Marcus and Emma responded immediately to Tommy's frantic radio calls, but the reinforced doors that were meant to keep threats out now trapped them in a deadly situation as they tried to rescue the surviving family members while avoiding the 2 infected adults who had already begun spreading the virus within their supposedly secure sanctuary. Michael Henderson managed to grab his sister Katie and barricade themselves in the equipment storage room, but the damage to their carefully constructed safe haven was already irreversible as the infected Robert and Linda began attacking the gymnasium's windows and doors with superhuman strength driven by their viral transformation. The group's worst fears were realized when the infected couple managed to break through the weakened window frame that David had reinforced with metal grating, creating a breach in their perimeter that immediately attracted the attention of infected roaming the nearby residential neighborhoods. Emma made the agonizing decision to evacuate the school entirely rather than risk a prolonged battle in confined spaces, and within 20 minutes of the initial attack, the 6 original survivors plus Michael and Katie Henderson were fleeing through the school's rear emergency exit carrying only their essential weapons and supplies as dozens of infected poured through the compromised gymnasium breach. Chat controls Sonnet 4. 5 grueling days after losing their sanctuary at Jefferson Elementary School, the exhausted group of survivors had taken refuge in the underground parking garage of the abandoned Metropolitan Office Complex, where the concrete walls provided protection from both the infected and the unseasonably cold November weather that had begun to make their outdoor survival even more challenging. Marcus Thompson found himself struggling with the weight of leadership as their situation grew increasingly desperate. With their food supplies reduced to less than 2 days' worth of emergency rations and young Katie Henderson developing a persistent cough that reminded everyone of how her family's arrival had led to their current predicament. The 16-year-old Michael Henderson had proven surprisingly resilient and helpful despite losing both parents in the gymnasium attack, but his presence served as a constant reminder of how quickly trust could turn deadly in their new world. Emma Foster's police radio had been picking up increasingly frequent military transmissions over the past 48 hours, including references to something called Operation Safe Harbor and coordinates that appeared to correspond to locations within their quarantine city. Tommy Bradley's technical skills allowed him to triangulate the source of these transmissions to a position approximately 3 miles southeast of their current location, near the industrial district where several large warehouses and manufacturing facilities had been converted into what the radio chatter described as processing and evacuation centers for surviving civilian populations. The prospect of finally making contact with legitimate government forces who might have the resources to provide medical care, food, and safe transport out of the infected zone filled most of the group with desperate hope. But Emma's law enforcement experience made her skeptical about the military's true intentions and the reasons why these operations were being conducted in complete radio silence from the outside world. Jessica Rodriguez argued that they had no choice but to investigate the military facility since their current situation was unsustainable, while Rebecca Walsh worried about exposing Katie and Michael to additional risks when they were already traumatized and physically weakened from their recent ordeal. After another tense group discussion in the claustrophobic confines of the parking garage, Marcus decided they would conduct a careful reconnaissance mission to observe the military operation before making any decisions about whether to make contact or continue trying to survive independently. David Carter used his mechanical knowledge to hotwire an abandoned delivery truck that would provide them with transportation and some protection during their approach to the industrial district, while Tommy modified their radio equipment to monitor military frequencies and provide early warning if the soldiers detected their presence in the area. The military facility turned out to be much larger and more sophisticated than any of them had anticipated, occupying several interconnected warehouse buildings surrounded by razor wire fencing, guard towers, and what appeared to be decontamination stations where figures in hazmat suits were processing other survivors who had apparently been collected from various locations throughout the quarantine city. Through binoculars from their concealed position behind a defunct gas station, the group observed dozens of military personnel moving with purposeful efficiency as they managed what looked like a legitimate rescue operation complete with medical tents, supply distribution centers, and transport vehicles that seemed capable of safely evacuating civilians from the infected zone. However, Emma's trained eye began to notice disturbing details that contradicted the appearance of a humanitarian mission. The survivors being processed through the facility were being separated into different groups based on criteria that weren't immediately obvious. Some individuals were being taken to buildings from which no one seemed to emerge, and the soldiers' conversations over their radio channels included references to test subjects, viable specimens, and data collection protocols rather than rescue terminology. Marcus felt his stomach tighten with growing unease as they continued their surveillance throughout the afternoon, watching as groups of survivors were led into what appeared to be laboratory facilities while others were loaded onto trucks that departed in directions opposite to the supposed evacuation routes that would lead them to safety outside the quarantine zone. When a convoy of military vehicles returned to the facility carrying what were obviously captured infected individuals and specialized containment units, Emma's suspicions crystallized into horrifying certainty that this was not a rescue operation but rather some kind of research facility where the government was conducting experiments on both zombies and human survivors. The group's worst fears were confirmed when Tommy's radio equipment intercepted or encrypted military communication discussing Phase 3 protocols for live specimen harvesting, and references to maintaining the quarantine zone indefinitely to support ongoing biological warfare research projects. Jessica's idealistic faith in government institutions was shattered as she realized that the authorities had abandoned any pretense of protecting civilian populations in favor of exploiting the crisis for military advantage. While Rebecca understood with medical clarity that the survivors being taken into those laboratory buildings were likely being used as unwilling test subjects in experiments related to the viral infection. The decision to escape from the area immediately became urgent when David spotted military patrols expanding their search patterns beyond the facility perimeter, apparently conducting systematic sweeps to capture any remaining survivors who might be hiding in the surrounding industrial district. Marcus coordinated a careful withdrawal using the delivery truck's cargo compartment to conceal their presence as they navigated through side streets and abandoned lots, but their escape was complicated by the realization that the military's radio communications indicated they were aware of civilian survivors operating in the area and were actively hunting for anyone who had avoided capture. The group's discovery of the government's betrayal and conspiracy eliminated any hope of official rescue or support, forcing them to confront the reality that they were now fugitives in their own country, hunted by both the infected and the military forces that were supposed to protect them. Chat controls Sonnet 4. The intercepted military communications that Tommy Bradley decoded during their desperate flight from the government facility revealed the most terrifying truth yet. Operation Cleansing Dawn was scheduled to commence in less than 18 hours, involving the complete sterilization of the quarantine zone through coordinated bombing runs that would eliminate all evidence of the illegal biological weapons research along with every living person remaining within the city boundaries. Marcus Thompson felt the crushing weight of responsibility as he realized their small group of survivors possessed the only proof that could expose the government's conspiracy to the outside world, but their window of opportunity to broadcast this information was rapidly closing as military forces tightened their perimeter and eliminated potential witnesses to their crimes. The KTWR radio transmission tower on the eastern edge of the city represented their only hope of reaching audiences beyond the quarantine zone, but the facility was located nearly 8 miles from their current position through territory that was heavily patrolled by both military units hunting survivors and massive hordes of infected that had been driven toward the city center by the increasing military activity. Emma Foster's tactical analysis of their situation painted a grim picture. They would need to traverse the most dangerous part of the infected zone during daylight hours while carrying enough equipment to establish a meaningful radio transmission, all while avoiding detection by military forces who were systematically eliminating anyone who might threaten their cover-up operation. David Carter worked frantically to modify their delivery truck with armor plating salvaged from construction sites and additional fuel capacity that would give them the range needed to reach the radio station, while Rebecca Walsh prepared emergency medical supplies for what would likely be their most dangerous mission since the outbreak began. Jessica Rodriguez took responsibility for organizing the evidence they had gathered about the government conspiracy, including recorded radio transmissions, photographs of the military research facility, and detailed written testimony about the true nature of the outbreak that could be broadcast to emergency frequencies monitored by news organizations and international observers. Tommy's technical expertise was crucial for planning the radio transmission itself, as he would need to override the station's automated systems and establish a powerful enough signal to penetrate the military's jamming equipment that was designed to prevent exactly this type of unauthorized communication. The journey to KTWR became a nightmare gauntlet through the most heavily infected areas of the city, where the concentrated presence of thousands of undead created a seething mass of rotting flesh and gnashing teeth that surrounded their armored truck as they pushed through abandoned streets littered with the remains of previous military operations. Michael Henderson proved his courage by volunteering to operate the truck's improvised ram that David had constructed from steel beams, clearing paths through debris and infected clusters while Katie remained protected in the vehicle's reinforced cargo compartment with Rebecca monitoring her condition and preparing for potential injuries among the team members. The radio station had been abandoned since the early days of the outbreak, its automated emergency broadcasts still cycling through evacuation instructions that no one would ever follow, but the building's elevated position and powerful transmission equipment remained intact despite obvious signs that military forces had recently searched the facility for survivors or useful intelligence. Emma coordinated their defensive preparations as Marcus and Tommy worked to establish the radio transmission, positioning Jessica and David at strategic points around the station's perimeter while Michael used his teenage reflexes to monitor the approaching infected through the building's security camera system that was still functioning on emergency power. The massive horde of infected that had followed their truck from the city center began surrounding the radio station within minutes of their arrival, creating a siege situation that would require them to hold their position for at least 30 minutes while Tommy bypassed the station's security systems and established a clear transmission channel to the outside world. As Marcus began broadcasting their recorded evidence about the government conspiracy and the true nature of the biological weapons research, waves of infected crashed against the station's reinforced doors and windows like a tide of decomposing humanity driven by an insatiable hunger for living flesh. Emma's ammunition reserves dwindled rapidly as she and Jessica fought to maintain their defensive perimeter, while David's improvised explosives created temporary gaps in the infected masses that immediately filled with fresh waves of creatures drawn by the noise and commotion of the battle. The transmission continued for nearly 25 minutes as Marcus systematically revealed every detail of the government's cover-up operation, including the locations of research facilities, the names of military personnel involved in the conspiracy, and the evidence that the viral outbreak had been the result of unauthorized biological weapons testing that had escaped containment and spread throughout the civilian population. Tommy's voice cracked with emotion as he added his own technical analysis of the virus and its apparent artificial origins, while Rebecca provided medical testimony about the infection's progression and the government's deliberate decision to sacrifice civilian lives rather than admit their role in creating the crisis. As the infected finally breached the station's main entrance and began pouring into the building in overwhelming numbers, Emma made the heroic decision to remain behind with David and Michael to buy precious additional time for the others to escape through the station's emergency exit. The sound of gunfire and Emma's final radio transmission echoed across the airwaves as Marcus, Jessica, Tommy, Rebecca, and Katie fought their way to the truck and began their desperate flight toward the city's outskirts, knowing that their former police officer and the two others they left behind were sacrificing their lives to ensure the truth would reach the outside world. The truck's fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank remaining as they raced through the pre-dawn darkness toward the quarantine zone's perimeter, while behind them the glow of fires and the distant sound of military helicopters indicated that Operation Cleansing Dawn was beginning ahead of schedule, possibly triggered by their successful radio broadcast that had alerted the outside world to the government's crimes and forced an acceleration of the cover-up timeline. 3 months after their harrowing escape from the quarantine city and the government's failed attempt to cover up the biological weapons disaster, Marcus Thompson stood on the front porch of a restored farmhouse in the rolling hills of rural Virginia, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded him of simpler times before the world had changed forever. The small community of survivors they had helped establish in this remote valley now numbered nearly 200 people, all refugees from various infected zones across the country who had made their way to safety after Marcus's radio broadcast from KTWR had exposed the military conspiracy and triggered a cascade of revelations that ultimately brought down the corrupt government officials responsible for the outbreak. Jessica Rodriguez had become the community's unofficial leader and teacher, establishing a school in the old barn where children who had survived the horror could begin to heal and learn skills they would need for rebuilding civilization in a world that would never again take safety and normalcy for granted. Her natural compassion and organizational abilities had made her indispensable in helping traumatized survivors integrate into their growing community, while her experience during the outbreak gave her the credibility needed to make difficult decisions about resource allocation and security protocols. Tommy Bradley's technical expertise had transformed their rural refuge into a model of sustainable living, with solar power systems, radio communication networks, and innovative water purification methods that allowed them to support a much larger population than the valley's original agricultural capacity would have suggested possible. His youth and optimism had returned gradually as he found purpose in teaching other survivors how to maintain and improve the technology that would be crucial for long-term survival in their changed world. Rebecca Walsh had established a comprehensive medical facility in the community's clinic, training volunteers in basic healthcare and maintaining careful records of the survivors' physical and mental health as they recovered from their traumatic experiences during the outbreak and its aftermath. Her dedication to healing extended beyond treating injuries and illnesses to include counseling programs that helped survivors process their grief and fear while building the emotional resilience needed for their new reality. Young Katie Henderson had made remarkable progress in overcoming the trauma of losing her parents and witnessing the destruction of their safe haven at the elementary school, thanks largely to the stable environment and the care of surrogate family members who understood the unique challenges faced by children who had survived the outbreak. Her brother Michael had grown into a capable young man whose experiences during their flight from the city had given him maturity beyond his years, and he now served as one of the community's scouts and defenders while pursuing his education under Jessica's guidance. The broader world beyond their valley had undergone dramatic changes as the truth about the biological weapons research became impossible to suppress, leading to congressional investigations, military tribunals, and the complete restructuring of the agencies responsible for biodefense and emergency response. International pressure had forced the United States government to provide massive humanitarian aid to the affected regions, while new laws mandated transparency and oversight for any research involving potential biological threats. The infected zones themselves had been gradually contained and reduced through coordinated efforts by international medical teams working with military forces under strict civilian oversight, using treatment protocols developed from the research data that Marcus and his team had helped expose during their broadcast from the radio station. Several former infected individuals had actually been successfully treated with experimental therapies derived from the government's own research, proving that the virus was not the irreversible condition that officials had claimed when they abandoned entire cities to their fate. Emma Foster's sacrifice, along with those of David Carter and Michael Henderson, had not been forgotten by the growing survivor community, and a memorial garden near the farmhouse honored their courage and reminded everyone of the price that had been paid for the freedom to rebuild their lives without fear of government betrayal. Marcus often visited this quiet space in the early morning hours, reflecting on the journey that had brought them from the chaos of the outbreak to the hope of their new beginning, and considering the responsibility he felt to ensure that the lessons learned from their experience would guide future generations in avoiding similar disasters. The radio equipment that Tommy maintained in the farmhouse's converted basement regularly received transmissions from other survivor communities across the country and around the world, creating a network of mutual support and shared knowledge that gave Marcus confidence that humanity would not only survive but ultimately thrive despite the challenges they had faced. These communications brought news of successful harvests, technological innovations, and cultural developments that demonstrated the remarkable resilience and adaptability of people who had been forced to rebuild civilization from the ground up. Jessica's evening reports to the community included updates from the outside world about the ongoing trials of the officials responsible for the outbreak, the progress of cleanup efforts in the former infected zones, and the political reforms that were reshaping the relationship between government and citizens in response to the revelations about institutional corruption and abuse of power. The survivors' experiences had created a unique perspective on the importance of transparency, accountability, and community cooperation that influenced every aspect of their new society, from the democratic decision-making processes they used for governing their settlement to the educational curricula Jessica developed for teaching their children about civic responsibility and ethical leadership. As Marcus watched the sun rise over the peaceful valley where they had built their new home, he felt a complex mixture of grief for what had been lost, gratitude for what had been preserved, and hope for what could still be achieved by people who had learned to depend on each other rather than on distant authorities who might not have their best interests at heart. The radio crackled to life in the distance as Tommy began his daily communication check with other survivor communities, and Marcus smiled as he heard familiar voices from across the continent sharing news of their own progress in rebuilding and healing from the wounds of the past. The world would never be the same as it had been before the outbreak, but perhaps that was not entirely a tragedy if it meant that future generations would be better prepared to face challenges with courage, honesty, and unity rather than the fear and deception that had nearly destroyed everything they held dear.